Good evening. If we could take a seat, please, we're going to get started. There are some drinks and cookies on the back table, so if anyone would like a little snack, please feel free to help yourself to that as the evening gets underway. I do know most of you in the room. There's a few faces I haven't seen yet, so I'll make it around to make sure I introduce myself to you. I'm Jay Lang, the superintendent. Happy to be here tonight. This is the first of three community forums that we're going to be holding to review some of the master plan options that came out of the work that Doran Whittier helped us with this past year. In a few minutes, I'm going to turn this over to representatives from Doran Whittier. And the goal for tonight is actually to review a little bit of the work that took place over the course of last year to refresh everyone's memories, because we actually stopped our last visioning session at the end of last spring. So there's been a little bit of time between the spring and obviously now when we're restarting again. So we want to just review the process that took place that got us here tonight. We also had, again, after the facilities assessment was done, there were several master plan options that were identified that were requiring some further vetting to be able to figure out if there is a preferred solution for the town for us to be able to consider. And so I think tonight's focus is really to go through the presentation, review the information, answer questions, concerns people may have, to really make sure that as a group we're on target. Chelmsford Telemedia is taping this, and it's going to be played so that people who can't join us tonight can go online and actually watch the presentation. And then we're going to have two follow-up sessions where we're going to get a little bit deeper into the master plan options, talk about the pros and cons, and again, Doran Whittier will walk us through that tonight. And hopefully when we leave tonight, we'll have a clear understanding of where we're going. So again, the few folks that I don't know, I'll actually make it around and introduce myself to at some point tonight. But to get us started, because we are a few minutes late, I'm going to turn this over to Brad Dorr from Doran Whittier, and he will get us underway. So thank you very much for coming. I know the conditions aren't the best to be traveling in, but I really do appreciate you coming out tonight.
Thank you, Dr. Lang. Again, I see a lot of familiar faces, a few new folks, and as Dr. Lang said, what we'd like to try and do for you tonight is to go back in time, take a look at the process. At the end of the meeting, what we'd like to do is open it up to questions. So we're going to go through, give a little bit of process background, and then go back and look at the options. We actually, when we went through and documented this, we had 17 options, I believe, and that list has now been narrowed down to 5. So just by way of going back, your team here with you tonight is, again, my name is Brad Dorr. I'm a principal with Doran Whittier. I also have with me tonight Jason Boone, who is responsible for a lot of the educational planning work. And then Michelle Rogers, who is our project manager on the job, and they're the smart guys in the bunch, so I'm going to be turning this over to them here pretty soon. Again, just in terms of what the process was, is we had teams of architects and engineers, site civil, mechanical, landscape, go through all of your buildings, all of your sites, really as an attempt to go and understand the conditions that they're in now and what that means in terms of both capital improvement needs over the course of the planning horizon, which right now is 10 years, and then also to take that information and to combine that with the educational piece of this, where we conducted visioning sessions, with the community, as well as all of the meetings that we had with the educators and the administrators themselves. And then we take those, that information, we compile all of that, put that together, and we really start to look at what that means and what that might mean in terms of overcrowding, undercrowding, facilities conditions, and what that yields in terms of potential capital planning projects as well. So we're looking at both the capital improvements, additional, larger than maintenance projects over the course of the planning period, as well as potential capital projects or new buildings or additions to buildings that would solve some of the space deficiencies as well. And then ultimately what we'll do is we'll take all of this, and we have a big thick book right here that's in its draft form, and as part of this what we're looking is soliciting input from the community so that everybody is as informed as they possibly can be as to what the master plan is. My understanding is that not yet, but at the end of this, the The school committee and the administration are going to be looking to try and consolidate the list of 5 shortlisted options that we have right now into something either smaller or perhaps even a preferred option at that point. So with that, I'll turn it over to Michelle Rogers, and we'll go through some more background for you. Thank you.
Thank you. Good evening. So we're going to talk about, first we're going to talk about the facilities assessments. And as Brad had noted, we went through the building with our team of consultants, the architects, the engineers. We went through all of your schools, and we looked at your interior and exterior conditions. We looked at your mechanical, your electrical, your plumbing needs. We addressed your handicap accessibility. We looked at hazardous materials that may still be in the building that are part of your plan for removing them. And we also looked at your functional use of space. So spaces that you're currently using for teaching spaces that are not part of what was designed to be a teaching space. Things like former janitors' closets, vestibules, and things of those sorts. And we've documented every piece of this. This is an overall graph of some of that documentation that we had done. We took 12 different categories, and I know most of you can't read this, so I'm going to read it out loud to you. So it's a site accessibility, exterior, interior, architectural elements, structural elements, mechanical, electrical, plumbing, fire protection, hazardous materials, and functional use of space. That's the column down here on the left. And then across the top, you see each one of the schools. And if you discount this last column here, that is Mill Road. We don't include 101 Mill Road in any of the options. So we looked at every single building. We line itemed every single issue that we had found throughout the building. We created what was called a capital improvement plan. All of that information is in depth within this book, which you can find online on your school website. And Jay will announce that to you later and help you find that information. It's quite in-depth information, and every single school has a category for every one of these 12 items, and then a capital improvement which addresses every item that you need. So what we did here was just give you an overall assessment of these buildings, and we color-coded it just so that you could get a feel for what these conditions are. What you see in red is conditions that were in poor or missing. So you see this here for fire protection. Several of the buildings don't have sprinklers, and that's why that's red. And then in other buildings, you have accessibility needs throughout the area. There's also the top row here, there's a yellow and an orange, and I know from where you're sitting, these two look very close together. Yellow is in fair or needs maintenance, and orange is in need of repair or those kinds of conditions. And then you also have the green issues, and you actually see that you have a lot of green here. Green is good, and the darker the green, the better the conditions. And we see here that you have a lot of really green across the board in your structural elements and your mechanical and your electrical systems and your plumbing systems. So overall, you're doing a great deal of maintenance for these buildings, but they're old for many cases. So you do still see the reds and the yellows within these buildings. In some conditions, we actually have 2 circles, and these are especially show up here in the mechanical issues where you have places where you've replaced boilers or gone in and replaced some part of the electrical systems. But then some of that distribution system, maybe the unit ventilators or distribution for plumbing and piping has not been replaced, and those areas need replacement. So even though you've taken care of one part of the building, you still have needs in the other part. So overall, this is the conditions that we're looking at for your buildings. And again, we then took all of these line items within that capital improvement plan for each of these buildings, and we sent them out to our cost estimator who works with us. And every item is here, and this is done over a 10-year period. So that's important to remember. So the number that you're seeing here at the bottom, which I know is an overwhelming number to look at, our categories were divided into 4 separate categories. There's high priority, which is something that needs to happen within the first to 3 years, your medium priority for 4 to 7 years, and then your long term, which would be 8 to 10 years, and then ongoing maintenance. So those are the 4 categories. And what you see here, that bottom number, the $59.4 number here, $1 million number here, about 13.7 of it is within that first 1 to 3 years. So if you think about that, that's a small amount of that number. And then about another 13.7 within the following 3 years, the 4 to 7. So a lot of this is out your 8 to 10 years, or it's ongoing maintenance. So it's important to know that if we saw something that was near its end of its useful life, but it had another 10 years, it's on this list, because you need to plan for it. And so that's why this number is here. We take the capital improvement number, and we're going to carry that through when we think about your master plan through the next 10 years. With that, this is one portion of what helps us get to all of our options, is assessing the existing buildings. The other portion of this would be your enrollment projections, and I'm going to let Jason talk about how we understood the enrollment projections.
Thanks, Michelle. To summarize what Michelle just said, while your buildings are incredibly well taken care of, they are old, and there are physical needs there, but that's just one part of the equation. My specialty is the educational part of the equation, and I'm going to start talking about that by reminding everybody of the enrollment projections. NESDEC is an independent enrollment projection consultant. They do enrollment projections for dozens of districts across the Commonwealth. In fact, they're the most common projection agency in Massachusetts. And they did a projection specifically for Chelmsford. And this is a chart representing their findings. The dashed lines represent some historic enrollment dating back to 2009, 2010. The solid lines represent projected enrollment for each of the 3 major grade groupings. The top line is the projection for grades K through 4, and I'll talk about the trajectory of that in just a second. The green line is actually the 9 through 12 projection, and the orange line is the 5 through 8 projection. You'll notice that particularly for the elementary school, the trajectory is in an upward trajectory as we head out to the end of the 10-year projection, a delta of over 200 kids. That's quite a few classrooms. While the 9 through 12 is remaining relatively constant, and the middle school trajectory is actually declining a bit over the next 10 years. Working with the school committee, we took that information and we made some decisions about what should we plan for. And keep in mind, this is all just planning at this stage. Right? None of this suggests that we're actually going to execute a building for any of these numbers. Right? We're still at the master plan stage. So in all 3 grade grouping cases, the decision was to plan for the most conservative possible number. Right? In other words, all of our options are based on the highest projected enrollment for each of the 3 grade groupings over this 10-year time horizon. Should the town and should the district ultimately choose to participate with the MSBA on something, more projections will be done. The town should probably do their own projection again in the near future. The MSBA will certainly do its own projection, and then those 2 things will be reconciled. So there'll be an opportunity to revisit this enrollment question well before any project is actually executed. But for our planning purposes, here's the numbers. For grades K through 4, around 2,000 kids, 1,976 children. For the middle school grades, 1,580 kids. That's grades 5 through 8. And for the high school, 1,509 kids. I'm not sure why that says 1,766. 1,509 kids. The yellow number down here at the bottom is correct. We also did a number of analyses related to the existing facilities. This is just a quick chart summarizing at the elementary grades the educational analysis that we performed. In the left-hand column, you see the existing enrollment. In the right-hand column, you see those target enrollments based on that K4 projection that I just mentioned. We analyzed the ability of each building to hold this number of children using 2 different methodologies. I won't go into the specifics of what those methodologies are, except to say at the elementary level, all 4 existing elementary schools were overcrowded by both methodologies. Right? If you look at the existing enrollment relative to either one of the targets, it's overcrowded. And similarly, if we look into the future, as the projections go up, it only gets worse. So from a raw student point of view, at least at the elementary school level, what this analysis suggested was that everybody is experiencing the pinch, and that it's only going to get worse if this enrollment projection proves out to be true. The other kind of analysis we did, because we have a grant program here in Massachusetts, and when construction happens within that grant program, there are certain spatial guidelines that have to be followed. So we did a quick analysis of each space in each building and compared it against the state's guidelines for that function. So if a room was being used as a classroom, we analyzed it relative to the state's classroom guideline. The way you read these diagrams, and we only put the thumbnails up here to give you a quick eye sweep and a high-level understanding. Red means a space is undersized relative to the guideline by 10% or more, right? In other words, it's 90% of the guideline or less. Anything that's yellow is about right size, within 10% on either side of the guideline. And anything that's green is oversized relative to the guideline by 10% or more. And so looking at the elementary schools, Byme is a little bit of a mixed bag, Center is a little better, Harrington is a little bit of a mixed bag, and almost everything at South Row is under the guideline. That doesn't necessarily mean it's not an effective space how the district is using it. This is just a common benchmark that we look at to compare spaces. And so the percentages represent the percentage of instructional spaces in each facility that are in that red category, to give you a sense of what the educational need is relative to space. Similarly, at the two middle schools, the high school and Westlands, same story. By the future projection, all of the schools are overcrowded by at least one of the two methodologies. And Parker Middle School is overcrowded by both capacity methodologies. And then here are the same percentages based on that MSBA comparative analysis to their guidelines. Of the existing spaces at Westlands, if we were to speculate about that becoming an elementary school again, 95%, everything but the stage, right, is below the guideline by 10% or more. Similarly, at the high school, 84% of the existing classrooms are below that MSBA guideline. We held several visioning sessions to keep everyone informed of our analysis along the way and to solicit input and feedback on various issues, and we covered a wide range of them. Some of the key things that came out of our visioning sessions were a desire to explore grade configurations that were different than what the district is executing today. What we mean by that is, in one of our exercises, for example, there was a desire to explore the idea of an early childhood center, putting pre-K and all the district's kindergarten children in one facility together. There was another desire to explore a conventional 6 through 8 middle school, right, which is different from the 5 through 8 model that the district has today. And so we've incorporated those explorations as a result of the visioning into our look forward. And ultimately, what the visioning sessions determined was a list of things that the options needed to do. What problems are we trying to solve? So we came to realize that many of the schools have missing or inappropriate spaces. The most tangible example of this is at the elementary school levels when special education students are receiving services in hallways and in the stair and in the exit corridor to the courtyard. Right, those aren't appropriate spaces for those services. The middle school science labs are another example. Right, they were designed as high school science labs. They haven't been renovated since they were originally constructed, and they're not serving the middle school science program as well as they could be. I talked about co-location of pre-K with an elementary school. Full-day kindergarten was a big one that came out during our visioning sessions which we think at least a solution has now been presented. We talked about overcrowding conditions, temporary construction. So the district has a number of modulars throughout the district. Ideally, in a long-term master plan, one of the things that would get resolved is the discontinuation of those as long-term spaces, right? In other words, all instruction would happen in permanent construction, not temporary modular construction. And then the last bullet is Michelle's findings from the facility assessment, that ultimately at the end of the master plan, what you would hope is that all of the physical facility conditions have been addressed. So these are the things that our options that we're getting ready to show are trying to solve. So Brad mentioned that we had something like 17 options. Here's a graphic that represents the full list. I have to commend your school committee and your working group. They kept challenging us, well, what about this and what about that? And can we analyze this scenario? Does that work? And ultimately, we explored every single one of those. Through a process of evaluation, which included some public meetings, that long list was shortened to these six, excuse me. The top one is, I'll describe these in general on this slide, and then we'll get into a little more detail for each one. Option A is to just continue doing what you're doing today and keep maintaining and repairing what you've got. It's the status quo option. We often say it's the capital improvements only option. For the other short list items, the school committee and the working group felt it was appropriate to look at a major intervention essentially at every grade grouping. So option D, for example, speculates about building a new freestanding early childhood center to house both pre-K and K. A consequence of that is that the Parker Middle School, because now it's only going to serve grades 5 and 6, would require an addition and a renovation of the rest of the existing facility, which is what this little dark rectangle represents. In option E, instead of an early childhood center, it speculates about building a new freestanding upper elementary school to serve grades 3 through 5. In option H, it speculates about a new freestanding 6 through 8 middle school. In option I2, it's a new junior high, housing only grades 7 and 8. And then finally, in option J5, it speculates about building a new combination of early childhood center and a new high school. And in that scenario, the existing McCarthy could come offline as an educational institution. So walking through these, the way you read these diagrams, if a tile is green, it results in a loose fit. In other words, the number of students proposed to be in that facility are less than the classrooms that you have in that facility. If it's yellow, it's about right-sized. If it's red, it remains overcrowded. So you can imagine if we're not doing anything in the capital improvements only option, all of the existing facilities that are currently overcrowded will continue to be overcrowded. And so in our list of objectives met over here, only the high school doesn't have overcrowding issues because its overcrowding issues today are minimal. It would, because it's addressing the capital improvements, address all of the physical building conditions, but very little else.
Modulars, the existing modulars are not included in this assessment. So even though you have modulars at Parker and you might feel that it's okay right now, it's red because we're not including those spaces as part of this long-term plan.
Yeah, it's an important point. We've mentioned this throughout our process, but we'll say it again. In all of our analyses, we didn't include the modular classrooms in our capacity analyses, right? Again, because of that statement that over the long term, modular classrooms shouldn't be long-term solutions.
And as Brad just pointed out, MSBA does not allow us to include the modulars for long-term planning. We have marked them as end of useful life within the 10-year period.
Moving on to option D, this is where we speculate about a new early childhood center. If that project were to be executed, then the existing pre-K children that are at the Westlands would no longer need to be in that facility, but it could continue to exist in service of the community education program. That step one in this sequence of the master plan would have a cost of around $47 million, just that one facility. Because of the grade reconfiguration that would occur as a result, the other 4 elementary schools would be grades 1 through 4. The Parker facility would become 5 through 6 only, and the McCarthy would be 7 through 8 only. And like I mentioned just a minute ago, as a second step, the Parker Middle School would need a fairly sizable addition to accommodate all of the children in the district for those 2 grades.
So in this case, the $56.1 million for the Parker School also includes those capital improvement plans that we've identified for Parker, because you would hit triggers for structural handicap accessibility and seismic within doing this addition. Yes?
Yeah, the question is, will the MSBA allow the district to pursue 2 projects at the same time? And historically, the MSBA has not allowed cities and towns to execute 2 projects at the same time. So that's why tonight we're going to talk about them as being in sequence. That the ECC, the Early Childhood Center, in this particular option would be step 1. As that project is wrapping up, perhaps you could start the grant application process for step 2, and that this one would happen in sequence. And so in total, you're looking at somewhere between 12 and 13 years to execute both major projects in this option.
And I'm assuming we get funding.
Correct. Both would be eligible, but it is a competitive grant-based program. So it is assuming that the fastest that those 2 projects could be executed, yes.
Do you know of any circumstances where they give that kind of back-to-back funding, or are they more inclined to give you funding for a single project?
Yes, there are lots of examples where cities and towns have been successful in executing back-to-back projects in a relatively short window, but I don't know of any personally where they have actually overlapped. Okay. So again, in terms of objectives met, this option does an awful lot of really good things. The one thing, I think this is actually an error, that the 2 middle schools would be right-sized in this case. But the one thing this doesn't do is explicitly address the middle school science rooms at McCarthy. Right? If we have a 2-step process here, whether or not the existing science rooms at McCarthy would be addressed is an unknown.
Before you go on, I want to point out that all the costs that you're going to see tonight are in today's dollars. So there's been no escalation. So even though we're talking about projects that may take 6 to 12 years, those are based on money today. There's no escalation for any of those costs.
And so if you add these 2 major projects together, the grand total is a little more than $100 million. Yes?
I know this is way early, but like, has there been any discussion along the lines of if we're going to build a new community center for pre-K or whatever, like where that might go or things like that?
Good question, and I'll just repeat it for folks at home. The question is, have we done any exploration for any of these options about where they could go or where they could fit? And the short answer to that is yes. For all of the options, in fact, we truth tested whether or not they could fit on certain sites. For good or bad, the most viable opportunity is the practice fields at the high school location, right? And you're going to see in just a minute some options that are rather large, a new middle school or a new high school, right? Of the sites that were made available to us to explore, that's the most likely location for many of these options, but we did truth test them all, and those site plans are, in fact, in our report. Okay. Option E speculates about a new upper elementary school. I want to note the size, 1,147 children. That would far exceed the size of any elementary school in the district today. But let me temper that with, there are lots of examples around the Commonwealth where you might execute a twin school. In other words, 2 independent schools under one roof. They could have separate administrations. They could have even separate entries, right? That can be expressed in a lot of different ways. But there would be, in this scenario, about 1,150 children under one roof on one site, okay? As a single-step solution, because the pre-K children are moving into the other 4 elementary schools, again, Westlands would be used to serve community ed and no longer serve that pre-K population. Cost of that, that single-step option in this case is $92.8 million. And in terms of the objectives that have been met, in this case, because we're going from half of 4 grades to half of 3 grades at each of the 2 existing middle schools, they're green because now they're a loose fit, right? And so that's why, in this case, the middle school's right sizing hasn't been checked, right? We're not achieving that particular objective. And similarly, because this master plan option doesn't explicitly say we're going to address the middle school science rooms as part of a major project, right? We haven't checked that box as well.
One more note, when we're talking about these new schools and the cost, these are based on cost per square foot. So we haven't designed these schools. We know how big they would need to be to serve the population that we're targeting. So they're based on the cost per square foot and on the MSBA guidelines.
In option H, we're speculating about a new freestanding 6 through 8 middle school, much like the upper elementary school. Pre-K would move into the existing elementary schools and vacate their portion of the Westlands facility. And to serve grades 6 through 8, this project would be just over $100 million. Michelle, did you have anything to add to this one?
I was being reminded that it's current dollars. Oh, current year dollars, I'm sorry.
Since we don't know exactly when some of these options may or may not be executed, what we did is we made an assumption that all project costs as they're being presented are in 2016 dollars. So dependent upon when some of those projects might fall, they would have to be escalated to, that point in time when they actually did occur. So just so everybody understands.
In option I2, we're looking at a new freestanding junior high school, which is slightly smaller than a 6 through 8 facility. Unlike the last option, in this case, Parker would become a 5th elementary school in the district, be repurposed to serve grades pre-K through 4. And the consequence of that grade reconfiguration is that South Row ends up being a loose fit, having a couple of extra classrooms at the elementary level. And you can see the cost here for this one-step option, $75.9 million. All of the objectives have been met with the exception of the elementary schools because of the South Row situation. Yes?
So the text up in the top right actually says Parker and McCarthy become 4 through 6 upper elementary schools. But then in your diagram it has Parker as K through 4 and just McCarthy as 5, 6. So I'm a little confused.
Yeah, we have to apologize for that. This text is not correct for this option.
So the diagram is right?
Actually, let me verify that. In I2, Parker becomes a pre-K 4 and McCarthy becomes a 5 through 6. So the diagram is correct. The narrative in the corner is incorrect. Thank you for pointing that out. And finally, in option J5, we speculate about a new freestanding combination of high school and early childhood center. The population total is for both of those populations, not just 9 through 12. So all of the pre-K and all of the K children in the district plus all of the 9 through 12s. And everybody else sort of moves up the ladder as a grade reconfiguration. So Parker becomes an elementary school. The existing high school becomes a new middle school. And again, McCarthy Middle School can come offline as an educational facility. And you can see what the result is that across the board now, this is a slightly loose fit for all of the buildings in the district. And then the cost for this one particular step, a little more than $200 million for a new high school. And again, most of the objectives have been met with the exception of right sizing, but they're not the right size on the little surplus room side, not on the overcrowded side of the equation. For those of you who might be wondering about what a pre-K 9 through 12 building looks like, just like we talked about with the upper elementary school, this could be designed in such a way that the two paths never cross, right? That the high school children aren't interacting with the early childhood children unless there's an educational reason to do so, right? Have high school students coming down and supporting the early childhood program. And so here's a summary of those options, right? Most of our 5 shortlist options have a single step. There may be things like the middle school science rooms or things like doing a little something to Parker to convert it to an elementary school that might occur additional costs, but we're trying to make this as simple as possible for folks. So this table is only reporting those major projects, and only option D has a second step, remember, where we have to add on to Parker Middle School in a second wave. And then you can see the totals here to the right.
I think one other thing just to mention here is you can see when it talks about option A, CIP only. So that's what was discussed earlier by Michelle in terms of those capital projects over the 10-year horizon. Each one of the other options, there is some associated level of CIP that would need to be implemented, but when you start to go and combine that, it starts to get very muddy. So what we did for purposes of presentation here tonight is really to focus those capital costs associated with all of the respective options. And then what's also included as part of the report, as those start to work themselves out, we've identified what the respective CIP that would be remaining to be spread over the other schools would be, because each option impacts schools a little bit differently. So with that information is also included as part of the master plan. However, just to keep it a little bit cleaner and more understandable, we presented it this way tonight.
And let me just add to that, should the district and the town be successful in participating with the MSBA, these are total project costs, right? Not option A, but the other 5 are total project costs that they would reimburse some portion of to the town. So these costs would not be fully borne by the town if they were successful in getting assistance through the MSBA's grant funding program. What that percentage is at this point in time is an unknown, right? The district has not participated in an MSBA core project, but once the district got into the pipeline, that number would be, that percentage reimbursement would be known.
And then finally, this is just wrapping up the chart that you just saw, putting a graphic figure to it so that you can see from the top, again with the capital improvement only plan, that's the 59.4 option. Your early childhood education program is option is 103.5. Your new upper elementary is 92.8 million. New 6 through 8 middle school would be about 102.5 million. Your new 7 through 8 middle school would be 75.9. I think we're calling that a junior high. And then your pre-K and K high school, as Jason just noted, is 203.5. And again, today's dollars and project costs only. So again, with this, there is capital improvements that go along with all the other buildings, but should you choose a particular option, say the I-2, you would then stop doing a lot of the improvements on some of those buildings that you would be taking offline in the future in 5 to 6 years.
And so this is the second to last slide of our formal presentation, but before we get to the next steps, let me just sort of reiterate what the master plan is doing and what it's not doing, and sort of what the town is asking its citizens to consider. What the master plan is not doing is asking the citizens at this time to approve a project and go out and get shovels ready and put holes in the ground, right? The master plan is only leading to the identification of a priority project to start the process with the MSBA, right? So there's going to be lots more opportunity for the town, the district, and the citizens to discuss what the pathway forward is, but the district needs help in deciding what the priority should be. So that's all the district is asking the town to do right now, is to consider which of these options are the priority for further exploration.
We're just looking at the master plan timeline here, and the statement of interest, which is called the SOI, would be going out to the MSBA. We're looking at the beginning part of this year, and again, we're estimating about 6 years before you occupy your first project. And for those projects that might have 2 steps to them, as you're coming to the end of the first project, you might revisit your master plan and submit an SOI for your second project so that you could potentially put them back to back. And that's how we get to the 13 years if you're doing 2 projects back to back. Going forward in the next few weeks, so here we have another meeting coming up on February 2nd where we're going to start talking about just the options. Now that we've brought you to where we are today, to explain to you how we got here, we would like to focus a little bit more on those 5 options and really dive into them and talk about the opportunities and constraints of those options. On the February 7th, we'll be talking with school committee again. And on February 16th, we'd like to have another public presentation at that point and circle back and talk about where we think we're going, where the priority projects might be. And finally, on the 28th, we'll be visiting with school committee one more time. So we have an opportunity to ask any questions that you might have. I can, yes, I'm sorry.
I just have a question about the maintenance going forward. You show a maintenance program of about $60 million. That's for the maintenance issues that are identified today. It doesn't indicate what the maintenance challenges would be going forward over the next 5, 10, 15 years while this is unfolding. Am I correct in that understanding?
Our maintenance program identifies correctly what we see as needs for the next 10 years. So, and we did some projections so that we know that if something is going to be nearing, if it's in fair condition now, it will be nearing the end of its useful life within the next 5 or 10 years, it will show up on that master plan as well. And that's why you have the 13.7 roughly in the first 3 years, 13.7 in the next, and the remaining 30 is ongoing maintenance and something that would be 8 to 10 years out. So we did try to capture those.
Other questions?
I know that you don't have a crystal ball, but did you make any assessment of the expected life of the existing pods?
I'm sorry, the expected life of the existing modulars?
Yes, correct.
We have them as being replaced in the next 10 years. So we think that they're at their end of their useful life.
Is that their service life will extend to 10 years with expenditure of some of the $60 million that you're recommending as part of going toward them?
The replacement of those modulars is part of that, yes.
Total replacement of the modules?
Not as a modular, but as a building. So you would
As a
replace
building.
that space.
So, but of the $60 million in recommended upgrades,
It is a line item in that, yes.
the pods will get some of that money,
Yes.
theoretically?
Right behind, yep.
Yeah, I'd like you to go back to the projection. Sorry. If you could go back to the projection schedule. Because again, you're projecting, like for the grammar schools, like almost, 2,000 students for the 4 grades?
5 grades, K through 5. I'm sorry, K through 4. 5 grades, K through 4.
I thought there was just 4 grades. Plus the you get the kindergarten.
Correct.
So I mean, that's 400, so that's 400 students roughly. Okay, the birth rate in Chelmsford for the last 10 years has been around 300 per year.
Yep.
And you're saying that that's going to go way up. I mean, in the next 5 years, the children are already here, and that's 300 a year. So you're telling me that we're going to have an extra for the last of not the first 5 years when people are already here. The last 5 years, you're going to have 500. I mean, to balance out to your 400. I mean, that's a grossly exaggerated estimate in my mind, and so I have a problem, with, in fact, 300 students per year, 300 new births for the last 10 years, 300, 5 years, 5 of those, this starts from 2012,
Yep. All fair observations. But what I
and
can tell,
again, you're projecting all this thing on the maximum potential need, which includes this 400 students per year. That's crazy.
well, so let me talk a little bit more about the methodology of the enrollment projections. So what NESDEC does is, yes, they look at birth rate, and yes, it's primarily a cohort survival methodology, which is year-to-year survival from first grade to second grade, from second grade to third grade. But they also consider demographic profile, and they also consider housing permits, and they also consider housing turnover. And so essentially what the demographer is saying here is, yes, you're absolutely right. The birth rate alone is not sufficient to maintain an upward trajectory. However, the demographics suggest that there's enough people in the older age bracket that the housing stock turnover is going to happen, and that's going to be the key contributing factor in the enrollment growth, not the birth rate.
But we've already, the kids that are going to be here the next 5 years are here,
Which is
which is
why
300.
Which is why the line is relatively flat for the first 5 years.
Okay, I still question that whole premise.
And right, and you're right too.
And again, the other question is, you don't even include in here, why did we buy 12 modular classrooms last year if you're not even including them? And you also said, I quote, modular classrooms are not included,
As a
are
long-term
not
solution.
included in long-term. So why the hell did we buy 12 modular classrooms if they're not long-term solutions?
Again, good question. The district and the school committee wanted to execute a plan to allow full-day kindergarten this fall.
I understand that, and some of that is needed.
And the only way, not the only way, the way the school committee chose to execute that plan was to purchase modular classrooms and place them at the existing elementary schools.
Again, I'm not a forecaster, especially of births of children, but that doesn't make sense to me.
I also think that if you look at the projection there, the 2016-2017, that is the lowest, and then it begins to rise up. So you're at this piece here right now where it's going to be, the kindergarten and elementary school grades are going to be increasing, according to the projections. Do you see the?
I'll be quick. So the first thing was, I don't know that we put the modulars in for the full day K. I hate to disagree with you, but we were addressing the overcrowding in our elementary schools, and it just so happened that that opened up the door for full day K. Okay, that was one thing. I'm at Byam, by the way. Now, my other question was, I was at the facilities meetings that we've had, and I don't remember, and I could have forgotten, but I don't remember speaking about, the plan for a new high school, including pre-K and K. My memory of it was that we talked about pre-K, a new pre-K being in the new high school, and the Ks staying at the elementary schools, and that might make the elementary schools a little less green, and then it might be less than $200 million to build. Just a thought.
I don't think in our full range of options we ever had a scenario where it was high school and only pre-K. Let me again check. 12, 9 through 12. We did have 5 different varieties of a new high school scenario, but none of them had 9 through 12 and pre-K. And my memory is, and others chime in here, was that during the visioning sessions, it was such a strong idea to have pre-K associated with something else that the kindergarten was the something else in this case, right? We did explore freestanding 9 through 12 high school without any pre-K or K, but the records that I was just looking at suggest that we didn't explore pre-K alone with the high school.
Yeah, we didn't. To that point, there were 4 or 5 different options that related to the high school as options. But one of the discussions that took place, and again, I forget which visioning session was the desire to possibly link the pre-K programming to the kindergarten programming. And a way to accomplish that, because it was too difficult to integrate into the existing elementary school structure, was possibly through that new high school building project, so that there was a new high school, you could kind of separate off the pre-K and K. That was the discussion when it was really more the desire to try to locate those populations together to have some continuity in programming. Again, there were like 4 or 5 different iterations of the high school plan itself, but the one that did kind of advance did take into consideration the pre-K and K, because that's what opened up the ability for us to then open up some additional classroom space in the elementary schools to do that grade level reconfiguration. Barbara, we just got to speak in a mic, though.
That also introduces a transportation cost that doesn't exist if the kindergarten is at their district school.
Yes, as far as if you were to do that, what would happen with transportation? You would be introducing like a centralized transportation for the pre-K and K to that high school center. Because right now you would have the elementary school transportation going to the elementary schools, but you wouldn't double up and put the pre-K and kindergarten students on the high school buses.
Right.
So you'd have,
Yeah, exactly, but it would still, if they were remaining at their district school, then Byam kindergartners going to Byam, they'll be on that bus. If we take them to the high school, it's a separate transportation.
no, that's correct. No, you're 100% correct. It's just that there was the high school option did take into consideration at that time the pre-K and K being in that kind of standalone center as an attachment to the high school. That's the plan that kind of advanced.
And I can add to the scenarios at the high school that should this be the direction the district and town pursues with the MSBA process has enough flexibility in it that the district can explore a project with the pre-K, without the pre-K, with the kindergarten, without the kindergarten, or with all of them included in the project. We've seen lots of examples where districts have explored multiple grade configuration scenarios all under the umbrella of one project.
I have a question that's for the school committee as much as for you guys. Did the school committee members participate in the visioning sessions? Actively or more as observers? Okay. And to what extent in the vision, and I'm sorry, I should have participated because I've been trying over the past 2 days to read all your background material and your visioning sessions, and I couldn't find the answers I needed. To what extent in your visioning sessions did the discussion of grade configuration come in?
We had a lot of discussion about grade configuration. It was one of the first things we discussed.
Okay. I don't see it reflected in any of the materials I looked at.
There were reasons for that, and I'm going to let some of the teachers address that because the teachers opposed certain.
Okay, let me just, that's my perspective, and I looked at all of these options, and my first reaction was, I don't like any of them. And for those of you who don't know, Mary France, I was a member of the school committee in the 90s. I was there when we went to the current grade configuration that we have right now. And I was there when we rebuilt the center school, so I have some background in buildings and space sizes and grade configurations. When we went to the current K4, 5-8, 9-12, and admittedly, some of that is driven by what buildings you have and how people fit into buildings. The 5-8 configuration did get to a lot of resistance, but one of the strongest arguments, and I particularly went with it, was it minimized transitions for children. In other words, they're in one building for K to 4, they're in another building for 5 to 8, and then they go to the high school. And my first reaction to some of these options was, oh my God, now you've added 2 transitions to their movement through the school system. And I guess in some way, before you're making the options, I would like to hear a discussion on the school committees. You're going to be picking these, your views, your rationale for whatever you pick, and in terms of the grade configuration, because I think that's a biggie, to go from, going from what we have now, which is a 3-step process, to a 5-step process, which you have in some of those where you're going K4, 5, 6, no, it was the one that was the early childhood building, then a 1-4, then a 5-6, then a 7-8, and then the high school. That's a whole lot of transitions for children. And to me, at that time, it was a very strong argument, the minimizing transitions. So that's just my reaction, and I hope you're going to be thinking about it. Who else is?
Jay. I just want to address that a little bit, Mary. These decisions aren't going to be made in a vacuum, and I don't claim to be an education expert, but there are a lot of experts in the room that we listen to. And again, I'm not an education expert, so I'm not going to say that this is not going to be difficult. I'm going to let the people that know what they're talking about kind of give us their opinion, and we're going to take it, and we're going to run with it and make the decision based on that. And we also have to be practical, what can actually be accomplished in the town. So there are going to be maybe sacrifices, and maybe they won't be, but
I recognize that sometimes you have to deal with who fits where and how you can do it. I also know that it's been 20 years since I sat on the school committees, and not quite, but almost 20 years since I sat in the school committee. And the philosophy has changed. I know a lot of school systems these days deal with these, upper elementary, lower elementary, et cetera, schools. I need to be convinced. I sort of like the idea of minimizing transitions, and I just wanted to point that out and hope you're thinking about it. Thank you.
That, if I can jump in for a second, then certainly Barbara can. That was a topic that did come up a significant amount during the first probably 2 visioning sessions. I'm not sure exactly without looking at it where it might be recorded in the literature, but one of the first discussions we had as a different working group, and even when we broke down by levels, was as a community, are we wedded to the existing structure of the K4, 5, 8, 9, 12, or are we open to looking at other options? And I think the consensus in the room was we're open to looking at all options, that we should look at the existing structure that we have. We should take into consideration other structures if there's a good argument that can be made. I think one of the things that we heard over and over, I think from educators and parents, community members that were in the room, that minimizing the transition was important, and also figuring out at which grade levels or which age levels of the students, would be less detrimental on a transition going into place. We did, I think, as a group, all talk about also minimally trying to have there be at least 3 years in a particular building, ideally 4, if it can happen as far as the ranges go. But we didn't want to see students moving, again, in a perfect situation, in 2-year chunks. We wanted them to be able to stay in minimally 3-year chunks. Now, you will see different plans that had, say, even at that middle school, one of the options had, breaking up 5, 6, and then 7, 8. That is one of the options. But again, each of the options has different pros and cons, but we at that point in time weren't going to just exclude an option just on its face for that purpose. But there was a considerable amount of discussion. We said we wanted to just be open to options and, again, just not rule anything out. But we were being very conscious of the, ideally trying to keep students at a particular school so that they can build that sense of community and be in that building for minimally that 3 years. That's what we were, kind of hoping for. But again, we didn't want to just exclude something because, again, cost will be a factor. The whole kind of district program will at the same time.
One of the things they did, the teachers addressed, is that there are natural breaks that occur. So they felt strongly that we didn't want to break at 3rd grade, but 2nd grade was a more natural break as far as developmental needs. So a lot of time was spent on this configuration and agreeing to these breakdowns.
I also encourage you to go online or look at the book, because we do have a lot of that information, the output from those visioning sessions. We can't cover it all tonight, but there is that specific exercise that we're talking about here.
Look at your reports on the visioning sessions, and I didn't see anything specific on a discussion relative to that. So.
We'd be happy to point it out for you too, and then you can study some more of it. So, any more questions?
I think you said in one of the many sessions that went on that if you were to exercise going forward with one of the options, it's probably 7-8 years before you actually see it come to fruition. Is that correct?
Yeah, right now, the MSBA process from being invited into the from submitting the statement of interest to walking in the door is averaging about 6.5 years. So if the district can get an SOI into the MSBA this spring, that's why the earliest possible occupancy we were noting as 2023.
And among the options that are on the table right now, do any of them or all of them mean that the existing pods and the pods we're about to purchase become unnecessary because the new construction will account for their capacity in their plan?
Yes, exactly right. In fact, one of the objectives that we had to meet was to eliminate the need for temporary construction across the district. And all 5 of the shortlist options would achieve that, with some options having more surplus in permanent construction than others. But in all scenarios, the need for modular classrooms would go away.
So that we would not need, in theory, more modulars at this time, beyond what's planned?
Beyond what you're planning to purchase now?
Yes.
10 years from now, the goal is not to have modulars.
And the existing
or 12
pods
years.
have about 10 years left. So in theory, by exercising one of the plans, they will come offline as the new construction comes online.
The modulars that you're purchasing now.
The ones that are existing have a life, you had said, about 10 years.
At the Parker School and in the middle schools.
So as the new construction comes on board, those can go away naturally because they will now be obsolete. Okay, thank you.
I believe that one of the options is to put an addition at the Parker School, which then takes care of removing those options, at those modulars.
Just to that point, I mean, that was one of the goals of the projects. Obviously, these different plans based on staging, and there's a couple of plans where you had to build multiple schools, so you'd have to build a school, and then 6-7 years later do another school. If there's anything that gets thrown off in that staging of the plans, obviously that throws other things out of whack. But the intent was to be able to basically remove the existing modulars from McCarthy, Parker, and the couple that are at South Row over that 10-year time frame as their useful life deteriorated, or they reached their useful life. Do you want to go over there or I'll go over here?
2 questions. So first, the proposals where we're possibly building new construction on existing practice fields, do the costs for those proposals include we're going to need to find new space for those practice fields?
No.
Second question, do we have any sort of sense of any of these proposals being more or less likely to be accepted from the MSBA?
Nothing that's being proposed would be out of the realm of possibility for the MSBA. We've said in previous sessions that, to our knowledge, we don't have any examples of a pre-K attached to a high school, but that doesn't mean the MSBA wouldn't consider that, right? So there's lots of examples where people have executed, 3 through 5 elementary schools, or executed 6 through 8 middle schools, or 9 through 12 high schools. So there's nothing in this list of shortlist options that the MSBA wouldn't at least consider. So on that, they're on equal footing.
In the models that are up there now, is the goal to be yellow or to be green?
Good question. Remember, yellow is right-sized, right? So within a classroom or two of the target enrollment. If it's green, we've colored it green because there is a surplus of 3 classrooms or more at a particular facility. And some of them have far more surplus classrooms than that. And the example I point to is these two guys, right? If you think about what that's McCarthy and Parker, what they're housing today, they're housing half of 4 grades each. And so in that scenario, they're housing half of 3 grades each. So you can imagine the loose fit that creates. And we can share, actual surplus count with you if that's of interest.
Well, so I have a follow-up question. In looking at J5, in looking at that largest model where we're building a new high school pre-KK, I realize that you extrapolated the numbers and you're looking at the biggest possible scenario for the high school in that time frame. But why would we want to build a school that's only within a classroom or 2 of that size when we're talking about such a large project? Like, wouldn't we want the high school to be green?
Maybe. For good or bad, the MSBA process will dictate how many students that project will hold, right? And like I mentioned before, the district will do its enrollment projection, the MSBA will do its enrollment projection, and then there'll be a negotiation that happens that says, this project will serve this many kids, right? And in that scenario, very rarely is there surplus. Right, what they'll ask designers to do is say, all right, if the enrollment grows unexpectedly, where can we place an addition in the future? Not how do we plan and design surplus capacity from day one. Does that clarify for you?
Very much so, thank you.
Do you have a question?
Yeah, does it matter what building level that's for in terms of being approved in that negotiation process?
No.
Is that, okay.
No, the MSBA in all circumstances will negotiate the agreed upon enrollment with the district, and that will be the number.
Jason, maybe you can talk a little bit about the green being based on MSBA guidelines and the programs that you're running today, as opposed to programs that you would choose for those buildings, for special education and any additional programs?
Yeah, so anytime you execute a project with the MSBA, project-specific planning and programming has to occur. So, for example, we have a client where their local class size policies are lower than the MSBA's guidelines for students per classroom. Right, that arithmetic naturally generates more classrooms than the MSBA, out of the box would suggest. The MSBA has historically considered those lower class size policies at the local level and fully participated in more classrooms that align with that local policy, even though it means more classrooms than their guideline would suggest. And so we would do that sort of exploratory exercise in any project that the district and the town would want to participate with the MSBA's assistance.
I was just going to add to Erica and Jen's point, if you look at the different options that are kind of the black outline, whichever, as far as like that right size model, whichever project ends up going forward to the MSBA, they basically, to Jason's point, they don't let you overbuild. So you're basically
Correct.
just building to the capacity because everything is based on the allowable reimbursable square footage. So whichever project ends up being the MSBA kind of eligible project, that one's never going to be green. It's always going to be yellow. But the kind of the side effect is the other buildings and how they end up getting reallocated oftentimes can then be green because those aren't MSBA projects and that might give us some extra swing space or capacity in the district. So that's why you'll see under the different models, those go green.
And that phenomenon is exactly what's happening in option J5 because again, the existing high school is a 4-grade facility currently and it would become a 3-grade facility in the future, but because it's an existing facility, you're not going to knock down part of it to right size it right. It's just going to be a loose fit because of what it is.
Can I ask about the thinking around the Westland School and doing this, and it's all of your options except the status quo, it's continues to be community ed. Was it ever considered repurposing it as a school? I think in terms of support in this town, I'm willing to bet people would like to see Westlands used as an elementary school again. And why did you go the route you went?
So,
Very good question. So we did take a look at that. And what you see in front of you is Jason's plan for putting grades K through 4 into this school, and let's go ahead.
This diagram is actually the MSBA comparative analysis first, right? That red, green, yellow, how do existing spaces compare to the MSBA guidelines. And so as an elementary school, all of the existing classrooms are below the MSBA guideline.
What is the current guideline for elementary classrooms?
So for pre-K, the question was, what is the square footage guideline for elementary school? For pre-K and K, it's a range, 1,100 square feet to 1,300 square feet. For grades 1 through 5, it's 850 to 950. And almost all of the classrooms in this facility are 750 or less. So what we took
Said at one point in time held 35 kids, but
absolutely understood. Let me back up here. We also speculated.
Lose the number of classrooms.
We also speculated about what if we renovated that facility. We're willing to repartition them, right, to serve and meet the guide. Because if Westlands is going to be an MSBA project, the spaces would have to meet the guideline, right, or be very close in a renovation scenario. So that's what this drawing does. So here you see pre-K, 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 right? Everything's now yellow, right? But what's a little harder to tell on this diagram is that this went from 5 classrooms or more to 3, right? It's a significant repartitioning of that facility, but essentially a gut renovation, right? And what do you end up with? Well, you end up with 7 sections of pre-kindergarten, which is too short, and you end up with 5 sections of kindergarten. So in other words, the Westlands facility, while we could put children in that, it's not enough to accommodate the growing population at the elementary level and no longer need modulars at the other schools. So we did explore Westlands in a significant way, and these were some of the key findings. Yeah, Michelle?
I just wanted to comment. So I think that what's important about like looking through all this, I teach in the town. I grew up here. One of my sons goes here currently. Our plan is to have all our children here at some point. When I attended the schools, I was in a classroom with 35 students. I sat on the back heater. I'm not going to knock the school system. What I'm going to tell you is I want better for my kids. So I think that's important to keep in mind when we're looking at this, that the direction we want to go in is positive, right? We want to be better than we were last year. We want to be better than we were 5 years ago. It's obviously a work in progress, but I think that's a really important piece of it, that we're not, I don't want to settle for 30 kids in a classroom because we can't afford teachers or we don't have the space. It's not ideal for the teacher, it's not ideal for the kids. It's just something to kind of think about.
One of the other things that was talked about quite a bit, anytime we were repurposing the Westlands facility into an elementary school or an early childhood center or whatever, was what happens to community education. We didn't have a good answer for where that landed. And so, although maybe a small consideration, it was another factor that was discussed as part of the evaluative process. Other questions? Yes.
When the proposal is made to the state, does that have to be a specific A, B, C, whatever, one of those 5?
Yes.
Or a variation of it?
Well, let me.
And then is there any possibility of change since it's a 5 or 6 year period before it's finally approved, if it is approved?
So the most complete answer is yes, but. So yes, you have to identify a single priority project. It's a high school, or it's a middle school, or it's an elementary school. Where variation can occur is in that grade configuration that I mentioned earlier. So you could say, we're going to explore the idea of replacing Parker Middle School, right? And you identify that as the priority. What you could explore is a 5 through 8 middle school, a new middle school, a renovated middle school, an addition renovation middle school. So there is an awful lot of variety that can be explored, but you do have to identify the one priority to start the process. Your second part of your question is, once you get invited in, you can't change your mind. So you can't change from a middle school priority to a high school priority halfway through.
There's a misunderstanding that it's only 18 to 24 months before you're invited in. The 6 years is before you occupy the building, so you're designing and building.
And then this is a legal question, I guess. What type of approval from the town or the town meeting reps is needed before such a proposal is sent to the state? And is the financing, set at that time, which I assume it isn't?
Thanks. If I can go back for a second, if you don't mind, and just kind of touch on the whole kind of application process, and I'll touch on the approvals and whatnot. From my experience working with the MSBA on these type of projects, you do need to select a priority project, as Jason indicated. You need to be able to signal to the MSBA as a district what you want to focus with them on. Do you want to focus on a high school priority, a middle school priority, elementary school priority? And that's what you actually put in your application, your statement of interest to the MSBA. When you then apply to the MSBA, they want to, if they're going to entertain your project, what you want to be invited into is like a feasibility study. So there's this whole period of time that you go through where, for argument's sake, let's say it was a middle school. We say we want to do something with middle school in the district. We put that in. The MSBA is going to come out over that 12 to 18 month period and actually work with the town to do another assessment, to take a look at the data that we've put together, to figure out, is this a project that they want to participate in? Because they're going to be, we're approximately a 50-50 split on the project cost. So if this was a $100 million project, are they going to want to put $50 million up for this project? At that point in time, that's when stuff is still in play. So again, you're not going to apply for, say, a middle school and then all of a sudden build an elementary school. But in that 12 to 18 month period, when you're working with the MSBA, is when you would actually figure out what project you want to move forward with. At that point in time, if they, and I forget the exact term, but once they say that they want to participate with you on that project, we would then have to come back to the town, and because of and again, I don't want to put Paul on the spot, but because of the dollar amount that's involved, there is some type of a public vote that's required for the financing of this type of a project. No. If we ever actually move forward with a $100 million project, there's a debt exclusion vote that the town would actually have to participate in. Like a ballot type question. But that's, 18 months, 2 years down the road, and that you would be actually voting on the project, which at that point in time can't change. So once you actually agree with the SBA, this is the project that's going to go forward, this is the dollar amount, the town would then actually have to vote to approve that, and at that point in time, you're locked in. So up until that, it's, somewhat of a back and forth with the SBA to help them figure out the process, if that helps.
I have another one. Why in option D, you talk about Parker needing full renovation or something? Why do you need to totally renovate that building?
Good question.
And only in that particular option.
So we have what we call triggers in our building codes, and they are based on several different factors. Some is the square footage of the building, some is the dollar amount. Right, so the addition actually will trigger some of those codes. So this addition would trigger the need for fully sprinkling the entire building. This addition would trigger the need to go in and upgrade all of the ADA requirements. You may even hit the seismic needs, depending on how we look at that piece of it. So there would be needs that are triggered by this, and so we're taking a conservative look at that and saying you would need to do all of it. Maybe you do, maybe you don't, but you won't know until you actually know what that project is.
You'd have to do that because you're putting on an addition.
That's correct.
And in addition to that, no pun intended, if that addition were to be executed in partnership with the MSBA would require that the entire facility be a 50-year solution, right? So you couldn't just build the addition and not touch the rest of the building. You'd have to have the entire facility meet that criterion. Yeah. These are really great. Any other questions?
Thank you. Admittedly, I haven't paid attention in great detail up until this point, so I apologize, but I have 3 questions. One is, how did we get from the 17 to the 6 options? So just briefly, what were the factors that brought us down from what was on the table to those 6? What was deemed the most important by school committee or visioning?
In the report, you'll see that we had an evaluation process where evaluation criteria were determined and defined, and then each option was scored against that criteria using a point system, right? And as we all may realize, none of these evaluation criteria are ever completely scientific, but there was an honest and objective attempt to develop a set of criteria based on the issues we were trying to solve, and then score the various options against those criteria. And these were the items that rose to the top of that evaluation process.
So who were the stakeholders in that part? Was it?
So we did 2 things. The working group developed the criteria, but we brought that criteria and gave the public an opportunity to evaluate the options, weigh the advantages and disadvantages of them in visioning session number 4. In fact, if I recall correctly, we took a straw poll of just the people in the room that night to see which of the options were preferred as a snapshot in time. So all of the options were presented to the public, and then they were given even a chance to identify advantages and disadvantages in that session.
Okay. And then if you could just talk a little bit about sort of the current space utilization before we do anything. I know you've got all red boxes at the top of that for status quo, but I'm thinking about community ed, and I don't know the hours of the day they're using that building, how well utilized Westlands is, if it just remains community ed. And I also don't understand what we're doing about the administration in the police station building. Was that part of this study at all or not?
So the administration building was, correct me if I'm wrong, was evaluated from a facility condition point of view.
That's correct. So we did look at the admin building for facilities needs, but we don't include it as part of our long-term master plan because it's not a school. We also looked at 101 Mill Road, which is owned by the school department, and the Westland School.
Was there any reports that came out of that on the condition of those buildings?
Yes, so the conditions of those buildings are in the binder and online, but it's not part of our master plan option because you can't put children in those buildings.
Brad just reminded me that related to the evaluation process, the school committee vetted those evaluation criteria and the selection of the shortlist as well. So it was the 3 different groups, the general public, the working group, and the school committee all contributed to developing this shortlist. And did you have a third question, Claire?
So can you just clarify for me, in each one of these, last 5 options other than status quo, there is some building going on. In all cases, is the land use anticipated to be the same land?
Yeah, so it was similar to the question we had a little earlier. We did test the feasibility of all of these new, construction projects in the district. And as I mentioned, the largest piece of property that is likely to serve as the location for one of these is the practice fields of the existing high school. We did truth test an addition at Parker, and although it didn't make the short list, we also tested an addition at the McCarthy facility as well. Yeah.
Yes, help me with the road, with the practice fields.
Graniteville? Graniteville Road.
Graniteville. Kind of behind McCarthy, right when you're driving up with the high school on the right, Graniteville. The big fields that are right there. The soft.
Yeah.
No.
If I'm coming up Graniteville towards Grum Hill and I make a left like I'm going to the high school, down
If you, if you're on the, here's how I would get there. If you're on the Rotary and you take the exit as if you're going to the high school, and you take a right, and the field's right there. There's a softball field, correct, there's a softball field, and then like football fields that are just kind of open, and then there's a baseball field, and you would take a right to go down the driveway to get to the high school, that green space right there.
And who are the athletes that are using all those? Is it the high school?
I would think largely it's school system people. We do have young kids, youth programs and things like that use that field space as well. We would have to find additional field space, but that was that was an area that there was existing space to be able to build. It's also centrally located in comparison to our other schools. When you're looking at like campus model type building, that's why that came into play. I know Al had a question. I just want to go to Al, and then we can come back to you.
It's not as relevant as it was a couple of minutes ago, but the question was asked about, how did you cut down from 17? Well, in my opinion, there was a lot of pressure on us to cut down because for the company to do research on all of the different kinds of areas for 17 projects was just ridiculous. So that was a major factor.
Just one more thing about property. It should be noted that the MSBA does not reimburse for property acquisition. So at least within the confines of this study, we weren't looking at potential new properties that weren't owned by the town currently. And that's something that could occur during the feasibility study process. So we were limited in where we could, explore building projects of this size within the confines of the current district.
And just to build on that, and then also to address the gentleman's concern about when the process moves forward and a preferred option is brought forward through the SOI process, the feasibility study that Dr. Lang was speaking to is a very rigorous process. And one of the many things that they do there is there's a requirement for the options to be put through at various locations throughout the district. So there's a requirement that each option will go and look at different locations throughout the district, as well as each option will be considered as a new project construction, as well as a renovated project construction or a additions renovation project. And each one of those will be reviewed and compared against each other. So that process, once a preferred option, is just really the starting step, and then you have to get the MSBA to buy into that process as well. So it is a fairly rigorous process that we're talking about here.
If we were to go with the model, or any of the models that had you building on the land where the sports fields are, if you're going with that J5 and the McCarthy building is no longer being used as a school, is that structure still remaining intact? And could fields either be put on that existing land with the building there or if the building were removed?
So let me clarify first. Even though we truth tested the feasibility of all of these on a couple of different locations, including the practice fields, doesn't mean it has to land there, right? By picking a priority project doesn't mean you're picking that as the location for the project, right? That can be determined, as Brad was just mentioning, during the feasibility study process. So we want to make that clarification. If McCarthy comes offline, the question about what happens to it is to be determined. Right? Certainly the building itself has needs, but could remain intact. That would limit the ability to put fields there. The town could choose to discharge it, discontinue it altogether, maybe keep the football field that's there. Or, as you're suggesting, you could explore knocking that building down and recapturing that area for some of the play fields. Again, all of those things would be explored as part of the feasibility study process. And you would get to weigh the value of, do we discharge that and take advantage of the revenue that generates? Do we turn it into something else for the district? Do we turn it over to, right? There's a lot of different possibilities for that. We didn't explore those what ifs, except to say those would be explored in the feasibility study portion if the town goes down that path. Yep.
Just a follow-up to Paul's question, could you explain, you talk about this rigorous feasibility process, could you explain the estimated cost for that and when the money would be needed to fund that process?
I think there's actually a range for that. It depends a little bit on where we're headed and how many options ultimately, and is it a one-stepper or is it a two-stepper? But the range that we see out there in the size range that we're seeing here is somewhere probably between $800,000 to maybe a little around $1 million. And there's a lot of benchmarking that you can go out there and look at for similar projects. You know, you have communities around here that are doing that. I know Bill Ricca recently went through that process for a new high school there. But typically we're seeing those, I know we're working on 2 or 3 right now that are in that price range from $800,000 anywhere to $1.2, $1.3 million.
Statement of interest is supported by the Board of Selectmen and the school committee
Yep.
at the end of March. When do we need to come to town meeting to get the $1 million?
When you submit your statement of interest, that has to go through the MSBA process. And when ultimately they've gone through and they've evaluated your SOI as compared to all the other SOIs, there'll be a notification process there, and then at that point in time, you would go out to the town through the Board of Selectmen to go and bring in that money for the feasibility schematic design phase.
Right now, to evaluate the statements of interest, the MSBA is taking about a year. So the window for statements of interest closes this year, I think the first week in April. Then they take the next 8 months or so to, as Dr. Lang suggested, for certain candidates, come out and talk more with them, do their in-house evaluation. And just this month, they've notified the districts that are going to get invited into the eligibility period for 2017. So just the MSBA review process takes about a year. And then what the eligibility period is a 270-day window for the town and the district to get all of their ducks in a row, right? So that includes lots of different things, including approving funds for the feasibility study portion. So in terms of timing, the earliest, you're a better door than a window, Dr. Lang.
I apologize.
The earliest that a town meeting for those funds could occur is likely spring town meeting of next year, right? But you would have that 270-day window to cross that particular threshold of securing funds and a couple of other milestones in that step.
I would personally just think from my perspective, that might be actually ambitious to be able to do that. I mean, that would be the absolute earliest, would be spring of 18. I think, you know, it's probably more likely if we submit the application in April with all of our approvals, if we hear back, you know, sometime in the December, January timeframe, I think it's, as you indicate, when people are hearing, if we're then, you know, invited into that eligibility period, then that kicks off that 270-day period of time from then. So that is going to take us all spring and, you know, probably the summer to do all of our basically it's our paperwork, it's our local votes, it's the certification of the student enrollment projections, the educational plan, all of that. You're probably looking at the earliest would be fall of 18 town meeting, possibly even likely spring of 19. So it is still a ways off, and that would be if we actually got invited into a feasibility study.
I'm more asking the questions for people to understand. So the vote for the vote, we submit a proposal this March. We get an answer first of the next year, 2018. We then have 270 days. During that 270 days, we need the $1 million to do the work.
Yes.
No.
You need to come up with the funds
During that 270, for the feasibility study.
for the feasibility study only.
So now you're 270 days, so now you're in the fall of 2018. You then get the money, the $1 million, okay? Then how long does it then take you before you then come back and do the vote to approve the project?
Good question. So depending on what project it is, a high school or middle school and elementary school, the feasibility study schematic design phase, which is the first contract, right, that you'll execute with an OPM and a designer, typically is about a year. But the more complex the project, the longer that feasibility study schematic design phase is. For a really complex high school, it could be 2 years for just feasibility study and schematic design, right? But we're seeing it somewhere between a year and 18 months on average. And then at the end of schematic design, right, is when everybody signs on the dotted line. The MSBA agrees to their portion, the town agrees to their portion, and ultimately you sign what's called a project funding agreement, right? And that's where everybody knows what the bottom line, breakdown is of the cost and each party's share at the end of that schematic design phase.
So just to give rough dates, a vote in March of 2017, two months from now, to submit the statement of interest. Another vote by the town, probably fall of 2018, to proceed with the feasibility study.
Yep.
Then there's probably a vote in the year 2020 to proceed with the project.
Yep, that's
and
correct.
Then it's occupied in 2023. So I think the risk may be that we get to 2020, we're now 3 years later, and we may not have approval to go forward with the project.
That's always a possibility,
I wondered
yes.
if that's what Paul was getting at in terms of when does the town make the decision that we're all in? And the risk we run is we won't know that answer if we're all in until 3 years. And when you go to the ballot and say, okay, it's now time to step on the line, which is what we just saw the town of Barica do about a year or so ago.
Right.
And then the problem is if we get it wrong, then we're back to square zero in the year 2020, and all these other issues are still happening.
And there is one other hard clock, okay, that gets set out there, is once you go through the feasibility and schematic design process, and you've gone through, and the MSBA has said, congratulations, we're going to accept to move you forward to the next stage. At that point in time, the town has 120 days, okay, to bring forward the appropriation for its share of the funding of the project. So that 120-day clock is key.
So the downside risk is we could expend 3 years, $1 million, and not have the town's approval to proceed with the project in the year 2020, and then we're left basically where we started.
Correct.
And I just think that needs to be in the minds of folks is what is the plan going forward? And because we talked last night about we really have an option at best case scenario to do one project in the foreseeable future, given the debt burden. And this idea of doing a project every 7 years and layering debt with 20-year borrowing periods is probably not attainable, given the past history in this community and given the challenges that we have. And I think that's the concern is if you move to 2020 or 2023, if you finish a project, we have one new building. Meanwhile, the remainder of our buildings are 50-plus years old.
Right.
And what is the master plan or the vision for the 30 to 50-year window for this community in terms of where are we going? And I know we're not the only community struggling with that. We see Tewksbury now having that discussion with their elementary schools and so forth. But I think that's what people need to be keeping in mind. And from my perspective is what is the long-term plan and what is an attainable long-term plan? Because we've seen, again, the last community effort on this back, now you're talking 15 or so years ago, were a couple false starts and then a slightly reduced project, which is significantly reduced from the original thing. And now here we are a dozen years later after the previous project was completed, revisiting the same challenges that were not fully addressed the last time.
Hi, sorry, it's just a follow-up. So I remember when you said that we could be down the road and that the town could not be committed to it. But isn't it also true that we could go through the feasibility study and the MSBA could kick it as well?
I don't know of any examples, I mean, you guys can chime in. I don't know of any examples where the MSBA has put the brakes on.
Okay.
Right. As long as the process is being followed and the submissions are made according to MSBA requiremms, there wouldn't be any reason for the MSBA to put the brakes on. Obviously, they have to agree to the project. I do know of some examples where some specifics of a certain design resulted in a storage space that the MSBA didn't want to pay for, and it was a circumstance where they said, we're not going to participate in the project if you pursue building this one space, right? So they always reserve the right to, play their hand. They're contributing a significant financial investment in these facilities, so we sort of have to play by their rules. But I don't know of any examples in my professional experience where they've put the brakes on without, any probable cause.
So is it a fair statement to say that if you go through the feasibility study, that, you know, most likely you're going to go through unless you have some of these situations?
Yeah, there are very few, there's no instance, as Jason was saying, that I'm aware of where the MSBA has been the entity that says it's not going to go forward. Typically what happens is when you're going through that rigorous process that I was describing, is the staff will not let it go to an MSBA board vote unless it's ready to go. So it goes through their process, through their staff, through their review, and if all of a sudden something's not passing muster, and they have a pretty good sense of what their board is willing to go and accept and what it's not, you won't get to a board vote. It'll get kicked back, and it'll get kicked back until it's done correctly, and then at that point in time, it will go forward to their board for approval, and we haven't seen any instances where it's been rejected at that level, and then at that point in time, that 120-day clock starts.
We have seen examples where the MSBA has said, you're not ready to go to the next step, but not kick districts out of the process. So for example, part of the rigorous process is documenting what the district is trying to do educationally. If the design that's produced doesn't match what the district is trying to do educationally, there's a subcommittee that will put its hands up and say, all right, hold on a minute. There's a disconnect here. Let's not move on to the next step until we resolve that disconnect. But the district isn't being kicked out of the process entirely. The other thing that the MSBA often does is say, you know what, you're trying to build a space that we don't want to pay for. We're going to let you do that, but you have to track it completely on its own, right? An auditorium at an elementary school, for example, right? But again, even in that circumstance, the MSBA isn't kicking, you know, districts out of the process.
I think the bigger concern for us would be, even if we get the local votes in March and we submit the statement of interest, there's a chance that just based on volume of applications and how ours actually lines up with what the state's looking at funding-wise, we may not get invited into an eligibility period the first time out. It's not uncommon for districts to have to, you know, resubmit their application the following year or the year after, because it's a competitive pot of money that the state puts up for these school building projects, and it's all based on need, and it's very competitive statewide. So there is a chance that we won't get invited in, even if we have a wonderful application this year and we apply. We may have to do it again the following year. That then just kind of keeps pushing your timeline when you would ultimately do a project further and further away. I agree with the other speakers. Once you actually invited into the statement of interest is accepted, you're invited into eligibility, you go through the process. Particularly when you get to feasibility, I don't know of another district that's ever been kicked out. Districts themselves have voted to not appropriate funding for a project, but the MSBA is really not likely. I don't know any other cases where they've actually kind of kicked a district out at that point. But there is, and again, that's one of the reasons in talking to the school committee, we're very interested in trying to submit an application this March, is to at least try to get our foot in the door with the MSBA, because there's still no guarantees you know, that our application will be accepted or will be invited in for a look, and it takes a whole year to really even figure that out. So, you know, that is a concern when we're just talking about, you know, this window of time to be able to possibly get our application looked at for future consideration.
One last question. What is generally the cost-sharing relationship? You know, I'm not asking for a guarantee. I'm just asking, what is the funding relationship between the town and the state? And does it make a difference if it's an elementary school versus a middle or high school?
The reimbursement rate, baseline reimbursement rate, is specific to the local district and the town. It doesn't matter what project the town pursues. And the way the reimbursement rate is determined is a multivariable algorithm based on a lot of different factors, among them socioeconomic conditions, how many children are on free and reduced lunch, those sorts of factors.
ballpark, our reimbursement rate would be about 50%. No guarantees, but
No, I
it's,
understand.
right, about half. The state would pay for half, given our current economics, and the town would have to contribute the other half.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
You have another one?
Sorry, I cut in line, but one of the questions that I had was, is part of the feasibility study looking at the appetite of the town to be able to put in their portion? And we were just kind of talking about that piece, that, you know, that is a piece of it, but it's informal.
Ultimately, you know, the MSBA wants to have successful projects just like everyone wants to have successful projects. So, you know, certainly that's part of it, and part of the process there, as they're trying to gauge that level of enthusiasm, is they will go out as part of the process and ask you to support the public process that you've gone through and participated in. These types of events, have you done them? Have all the meetings been open? Then they also go and they ask about where are the Board of Selectmen, because they also have to be participatory in allowing you even to submit the various stages of the application. So that's how they're really starting to be able to gauge, you know, kind of the level of support within the community.
Any other questions? Okay, a few things that I would recommend as we kind of get or transition into the next two sessions and how we want to handle those. One of the things that we will do in the interim between now and the next session, Paul, I think would be helpful if we actually put together a little chart that actually would show all these different timelines and the different local votes, and, you know, when the votes are taken, who are they taken by, you know, what's required as far as funding votes. We'll put that together just so that you can actually see the timeline at the next session. I think when we do get together the next time, part of our agenda planning was really to dive deeply into each of the 5 or 6 options. Look at the thought process that went into them, look at the pros and cons. You know, funding is obviously one of them, you know, grade level reconfigurations, all of that different information is what the intent of the next session really was. I think we also should, again, we're going to advertise it and try to get as many individuals to attend as possible, but we need to have, or really start to have, that very serious conversation about what do we think the community will ultimately support, because I don't think it's to anyone's advantage, you know, for us to have, you know, Plan A, and in this room, we all think it's the best plan in the world, and it's the plan we want to go down. If it's a plan that calls for, you know, realistically, these staggered programs, and every 6 or 7 years, we're going to need to go back and rebond and add to the debt capacity. If we just don't have it, we should just have that conversation and be very practical and real about that at the next time, because that might help us when we're looking at different options, figure out if something is realistic or if it's not realistic. So I think we should have that conversation and just have a very open and honest conversation about that, and start to figure out if there is some consensus on one of these options. And as a group, do we really feel that, you know, if we do something at the elementary level, it's going to do A and B? If we do something at the high school level, that's going to help us up and set us up for the years to come. I'd like to see if we could start to kind of move the discussion to see if there's some consensus in a particular area, one way or the other, to then be able to, at that third session, you know, really, again, go very, very deeply into that, you know, 1 or 2 options that remain at that point in time, and again, you know, kind of see what comes out of it. One of the things we will do is this presentation that was made today, I'll work with the Durham Whittier individuals to just update those couple of slides that had a couple of corrections that we needed, just so that we're putting really accurate information out to the public. That slide is up on our website today, but we'll update it as soon as we get back and repost it. We'll push those out to families as well so that they can see it again. We'll push it out to staff and ask people to contact us with any questions that they may have after reading the presentations, so that we could possibly start to put together a little, you know, FAQ type document to track some of the discussions that have happened here tonight, as well as, even if people can't from the public attend these sessions, give them the opportunity to present their questions so that we can actually have answers for them, and then hopefully try to, you know, have a better dialogue the next time we get together. But I will help and facilitate some of that timeline work that's necessary. Again, kind of pushing those next two meetings. The school committee at their next two sessions is going to receive an update from Dora Whittier on, what we talked about this evening. So again, this is going to be in the public. This is going to be talked about over the next month and a half or so, as we really do try to line up to see if there's consensus around submitting an SOI for that April, early first week in April timeframe, to at least be able to be considered, 2-3 years down the line for a new project. So I would leave it at that. I would thank everyone for coming this evening. Again, we'll push some information out through ConnectEd. We'll push information out through the website. If you're hearing from people or talking to people that have any questions after tonight, they're certainly welcome to, email me directly or any of the members of the admin group if they want to receive information. Email school committee members. You're certainly welcome to come to a school committee meeting if it's going to be a topic on the agenda if there's a question. And we'll see where the dialogue goes over the next week or two. And I believe our next date is February 2nd, if I'm correct. February 2nd will be the night that we really kind of do a deep dive into those six master plan options and the pros and cons and try to see which direction we should head in. So again, I know the weather was not optimal tonight. Thank you very much for coming out and spending the time to do this important work with us. We appreciate it. Please grab a refreshment on the way out, and we will see you on February 2nd. Thank you.